Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary bedrooms of medieval royalty, where power, lust, and absolutely no concept of boundaries collided in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me tell you, what we're diving into today makes modern relationship drama look like a polite disagreement over dinner reservations. Picture this. You're living in an age where your marriage was probably arranged by someone who'd never met you. Contraception was basically hoping really hard. And the concept of privacy meant closing the castle door. Maybe. In this world, adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a political earthquake, a social catastrophe, and often a one-way ticket to some truly creative forms of punishment that would make modern divorce lawyers weep with gratitude for their simple paperwork. Let's be clear about something right from the start. Medieval justice wasn't exactly known for its subtlety or its mercy. These were people who thought public executions were quality family entertainment, and that the best way to test if someone was telling the truth was to make them hold a red-hot iron bar. So when it came to marital infidelity, you can imagine they didn't exactly lean toward couples therapy and meaningful conversations. But here's where it gets really twisted. While women had no legal control over their own sexuality, they were held completely responsible for any sexual transgression that occurred. If a woman committed adultery, it wasn't just her fault. It was evidence of her fundamental moral corruption, her failure to properly guard her husband's property, herself, and her rebellion against the divine order that placed her under male authority. Medieval society, where you could be simultaneously powerless and completely culpable. The legal consequences for female adultery were consistently more severe than those for male adultery across virtually every medieval jurisdiction. Voila! Man's adultery might result in fines, temporary exile, or public penance. A woman's adultery could result in death, mutilation, permanent exile, or slavery. The reasoning was both simple and horrifying. A woman's adultery threatened the legitimacy of her husband's heirs, while a man's adultery merely created some inconvenient bastards who had no legal claim to inheritance thought to be fair and evil legal. Theorists did develop elaborate justifications for this gender disparity that went beyond simple misogyny. They argued that women were naturally more lustful and less rational than men, making them more susceptible to sexual temptation and therefore requiring stricter control and harsher punishment. They also argued that female adultery was inherently more damaging to social order because it introduced uncertainty into inheritance lines and family structures. Medieval logic, where biological determinism met property law and somehow made sense. The concept of honor played a crucial role in determining how female adultery was punished. But female honor was fundamentally different from male honor. A man's honor was based on his achievements, his courage, his ability to protect his family and property. A woman's honor was based entirely on her sexual purity, first as a virgin, then as a faithful wife. Once that honor was lost through adultery, it could never be recovered, making female sexual transgression a permanent stain that affected not just the woman herself, but her entire family line. Medieval marriage practices made female adultery both more likely and more severely punished through a system of arranged marriages that often paired women with much older men they had never met. Young women in their teens were routinely married to men in their 40s or 50s for political or economic reasons, creating marriages where emotional and sexual compatibility were irrelevant considerations. Then, when these same young women saw emotional or sexual fulfillment elsewhere, they faced brutal punishment for failing to honor contracts they had no role in negotiating. The economic reality of women's lives made adultery particularly complicated and dangerous. Medieval women had limited opportunities for economic independence. They couldn't own property in their own right, couldn't enter most trades or professions, and couldn't legally represent themselves in court. This meant that a woman convicted of adultery faced not just immediate punishment, but potential destitution and social death. A woman cast out for adultery had few options for survival beyond begging, prostitution, or entering a convent if one would accept her. And yet, medieval women developed remarkable strategies for navigating the dangerous terrain of marital relationships and sexual desire. Court records reveal elaborate networks of female cooperation designed to conceal adultery, provide alibis, and protect each other from the worst consequences of sexual transgression. Women served as lookouts, message carriers, and character witnesses for each other, creating informal support systems that helped some women survive in a legal system designed to destroy them. The role of servants and lower class women in facilitating noble adultery created additional layers of vulnerability and exploitation. Noble women conducting affairs often relied on their female servants to arrange meetings, carry messages, and provide cover stories. These servants faced the same brutal punishments as their mistresses if discovered, but without the social connections or financial resources that might provide some protection. Medieval class system, where even adultery had a servant problem. Medieval literature reveals fascinating insights into women's attitudes toward adultery and marriage, though it's important to remember that most of this literature was written by men and reflected male fantasies about female sexuality rather than actual female experiences. Still, the popularity of stories about clever women outwitting their husbands, escaping arranged marriages, or finding true love despite social constraints suggests that medieval audiences, including women, were deeply engaged with questions about female agency and sexual autonomy. The concept of courtly love created a particularly cruel irony for medieval women. This literary and cultural movement celebrated the idea of passionate, idealized love between knights and noble ladies. But it specifically required that this love remain unconsummated and spiritually pure. Women were simultaneously elevated as objects of worship and constrained by impossible standards of purity that made actual human relationships nearly impossible to navigate safely. Meanwhile, the Church's teaching about marriage and sexuality created additional contradictions for medieval women. Christian doctrine taught that marriage was a partnership of equals in the eyes of God, but church law and practice consistently reinforced male authority and female subordination. Women were told that their highest calling was to be faithful wives and mothers, but they were also taught that sexuality, even within marriage, was inherently sinful and corrupting. The practice of sanctuary provided one of the few legal protections available to women accused of adultery, but even this protection was limited and uncertain. A woman who sought sanctuary in a church could theoretically escape immediate punishment while church authorities investigated her case. But sanctuary was only temporary and often merely delayed rather than prevented brutal punishment. Moreover, seeking sanctuary was often interpreted as an admission of guilt, making it a dangerous gamble for innocent women. The phenomenon of feminist adultery, women who committed adultery specifically as an act of rebellion against oppressive marriages or social constraints, is difficult to document, but appears in enough medieval sources to suggest it was a real phenomenon. Some women seem to have used adultery as a form of protest against marriages they never consented to, husbands who abused them, or social systems that denied them any form of agency or self-determination. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval women's experience with adultery law was the way it turned women against each other. The same legal system that brutally punished female adultery also rewarded women who reported, investigated, and testified against other women's sexual transgressions. Accusations of adultery became weapons in family disputes, property conflicts, and personal vendettas. creating a climate of suspicion and betrayal that poisoned relationships between women. The medical understanding of female sexuality in the medieval period added another layer of complexity to adultery accusations and punishments. Medieval physicians and theologians believed that women were naturally more lustful than men, but also that they required sexual satisfaction for physical and mental health. This created impossible contradictions. Women were expected to be sexually available to their husbands, but sexually pure in all other contexts. Sexually satisfied but not sexually assertive, and sexually knowledgeable but sexually innocent. Still, some medieval women managed to navigate these contradictions with remarkable skill and creativity. Court records reveal women who successfully defended themselves against adultery accusations, negotiated favorable settlements after being caught in affairs, or even turned adultery accusations against their accusers. These cases were rare, but they demonstrate that medieval women were not simply passive victims of an oppressive system. They were active agents who fought for survival and dignity within impossible constraints. Of course, the vast majority of medieval women accused of adultery lacked the resources, connections, or legal knowledge necessary to mount effective defenses. For most women, an adultery accusation meant immediate social death, followed by whatever physical punishment the local authorities felt like imposing. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lived long enough to serve as permanent examples of what happened to women who dared to assert sexual agency in a world designed to deny them any form of autonomy. The legacy of medieval adultery law shaped attitudes toward women and sexuality that persisted for centuries after the medieval period ended. The fundamental assumptions that women's sexuality was inherently dangerous, that female sexual transgression was more serious than male sexual transgression, and that women's value was primarily determined by their sexual purity, all became deeply embedded in Western culture and law. Medieval attitudes toward female adultery didn't disappear with the end of the medieval period. They evolved and adapted to new social and legal contexts while maintaining their essential character. Let's be honest, medieval law was about as consistent as medieval weather, which is to say it could change dramatically depending on where you were standing and who happened to be in charge that particular day. But when it came to adultery, there were some fascinatingly twisted common threads that wove through the legal systems of medieval Europe, each one designed to make sure that straying spouses understood exactly how expensive their wandering eyes could become. The foundation of medieval adultery law rested on a principle that would make modern feminists spontaneously combust. A woman was essentially property, first of her father, then of her husband. This wasn't just social convention. It was legal doctrine backed up by centuries of Roman law, Germanic tribal customs, and Christian theology all mixed together in a cocktail of systematic oppression that somehow managed to be both deeply misogynistic and wildly ineffective at actually preventing adultery. Canon law, the legal system of the Catholic Church, dominated medieval thinking about marriage and adultery throughout most of Europe. According to the Church, marriage was a sacrament, which meant that adultery wasn't just a crime against your spouse. It was a sin against God himself. That's right. When you snuck off to the hay barn with your neighbor's wife, you were personally offending the creator of the universe. Talk about performance anxiety. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean contradictory in ways that would make a philosophy professor weep. Canon law technically considered adultery equally sinful regardless of gender. In the eyes of God, a cheating husband was just as guilty as a cheating wife. Meanwhile, secular law, the stuff enforced by kings and nobles, operated on completely different principles, where a woman's adultery was a form of theft against her husband's property rights, while a man's adultery was basically Tuesday, unless it involved another man's property. To be fair, this created a legal nightmare that kept medieval lawyers busier than modern ambulance chasers. Imagine trying to prosecute an adultery case where the church court says one thing, the king's court says another, and the local lord has his own opinions based on whatever he had for breakfast that morning. Sound familiar? Well, maybe not exactly, but the whole multiple competing legal systems thing certainly has modern parallels. The Germanic, tribal laws that formed the backbone of early medieval legal codes had their own charming approach to adultery. Under Salic law, a woman caught in adultery could be killed by her husband with no legal consequences whatsoever. The Lombard laws allowed a husband to kill both his wife and her lover, or alternatively, to sell his wife into slavery. And yet, these same legal codes often included elaborate compensation systems, where the wronged husband could accept payment instead of blood. Medieval law, where you could literally put a price on your spouse's fidelity. English common law, as it developed through the medieval period, took a slightly different approach that managed to be both more civilized and somehow more humiliating. Rather than immediate death sentences, English law developed a complex system of public punishments designed to shame adulterers back into line. The famous carting punishment forced adulteresses to be paraded through town on a cart while locals pelted them with whatever rotten vegetables happened to be handy. Medieval England, where public humiliation was both punishment and entertainment. Meanwhile, across the Channel, French medieval law was developing its own delightfully specific punishments. The chemise punishment required adulterous women to walk through their community wearing only a thin shift, carrying a candle, and publicly confessing their sins. French legal codes also developed the concept of flagrant adultery, essentially catching someone in the act, which carried different penalties than adultery that had to be proven through testimony or evidence. Medieval France, where timing was everything, and not in a good way. Spanish medieval law, heavily influenced by both Roman traditions and Islamic legal concepts from the period of Moorish rule, created some of the most elaborate adultery statutes in medieval Europe. The Siete Partidas, a comprehensive legal code compiled in the 13th century, dedicated extensive sections to defining exactly what constituted adultery, who could accuse whom, what evidence was acceptable, and what punishments were appropriate. For different social classes, medieval Spain, where they wrote the book on adultery law, literally. Of course, the reality of how these laws were actually enforced was about as consistent as a medieval weather forecast. A wealthy noble caught in adultery might face nothing more than a stern talking to and perhaps a temporary exile to another castle. A peasant woman accused of the same crime might find herself facing death, mutilation, or slavery. The law might have been written down, but its application depended entirely on social status, political connections, and how much the local authorities felt like enforcing it that particular day. Italian city-states developed perhaps the most sophisticated and most contradictory approaches to adultery law. Venice, with its complex maritime trading relationships, developed legal codes that took into account the reality that husbands might be away for months or years at a time. Venetian law created different categories of adultery based on circumstances, duration, and the social status of the participants. Florence, always trying to outdo Venice, developed even more elaborate legal frameworks that included provisions for everything from love potions to financial compensation for damaged reputations. But here's the really fascinating part. Medieval legal scholars were actually quite sophisticated in their thinking about adultery law, even if their conclusions were often horrifying by modern standards. Legal treatises from the period show extensive debate about questions that wouldn't be out of place in a modern law school. What constitutes consent? How should intention be weighed against action? What role should social class play in determining punishment? When is circumstantial evidence sufficient for conviction? The answers they came up with were often brutal. but the questions themselves reveal a level of legal sophistication that challenges modern assumptions about medieval ignorance. These weren't primitive people stumbling around in the dark. They were sophisticated legal thinkers working within a framework of assumptions about gender, property, and social order that happened to be fundamentally different from our own. And yet, for all their sophistication, medieval legal systems consistently failed to actually prevent adultery. Despite punishments that ranged from public humiliation to gruesome death, people kept cheating on their spouses with remarkable regularity. Medieval court records are filled with adultery cases, suggesting that either the punishments weren't effective deterrents or medieval people were remarkably bad at risk assessment. Probably both. Still, these legal frameworks shaped medieval society in profound ways, creating a world where the stakes of sexual transgression were literally life and death, where marriage was as much a political and economic arrangement as a personal relationship, and where the law served not just to punish wrongdoing but to reinforce the fundamental power structures that kept medieval society functioning. Or at least, that kept it limping along from one crisis to the next. If you thought medieval justice was blind, think again. Medieval law had 20/20 vision when it came to social class, and nowhere was this more apparent than in how adultery was punished. The medieval world operated on a simple principle that would make modern egalitarians spontaneously combust. Different rules for different people. And those differences weren't subtle suggestions. They were carved in stone, enforced with steel, and justified by elaborate theological arguments about divine order. Let's start at the top of the social ladder, where the air was rarefied and the hypocrisy was thick enough to cut with a sword. Medieval nobility didn't just live by different rules. They lived in a completely different moral universe, where adultery was less a sin and more a diplomatic tool. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, who managed to be married to two different kings and rumored to have conducted affairs with everyone from her uncle to various troubadours, all while maintaining her position as one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. Sound familiar? Well, maybe not the troubadour part, but the whole different standards for the powerful thing certainly rings a bell. Noble adultery was a complex game of political chess, where the stakes weren't just personal honor but international. Alliances, inheritance rights, and sometimes the fate of entire kingdoms. When Philip II of France accused his wife, Ingeborg of Denmark, of, well, various things that probably weren't true, it wasn't really about marital fidelity. It was about French foreign policy. Medieval marriage among the nobility was essentially international diplomacy with better outfits and more uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. To be fair, noble women who committed adultery did face consequences, just not the same consequences as everyone else. Instead of public whipping or execution, a noble adulteress might face annulment of her marriage, loss of her dowry, exile to a convent, or in extreme cases, imprisonment in a tower. Medieval nobility, where even punishment came with better accommodations. The concept of courtly love, that romanticized ideal of chivalrous devotion to an unattainable lady, created a fascinating paradox in noble circles. Knights were literally expected to fall in love with married women, preferably their lord's wife, and to express this love through poetry, gift-giving, and elaborate displays of devotion. The catch? This love was supposed to remain chaste and spiritual. Medieval nobles, where adultery was forbidden but falling in love with someone else's spouse was basically a job requirement. But here's where it gets really twisted. The same noble courts that celebrated courtly love and turned a blind eye to aristocratic affairs came down like the wrath of God on servants, peasants, and anyone else who dared to transgress across class lines. A noble having an affair with another noble might result in some awkward dinner parties and perhaps a strategic marriage annulment. A servant seducing a noble? That was a death sentence waiting to happen. Meanwhile, down in the peasant villages, adultery was handled with the kind of brutal efficiency that made noble punishments look like strongly worded letters. Peasant adultery threatened the fundamental economic unit of medieval society. The household and communities responded accordingly. Village courts didn't have time for elaborate legal proceedings or theological debates. They had crops, till harvest, and survival to worry about. Peasant women caught in adultery faced punishments that ranged from public humiliation to physical violence to expulsion from the community entirely. The famous rough music, or shurry, where the entire village would gather outside an adulterous house to make noise, sing insulting songs, and generally make life unbearable, was specifically designed to shame sexual transgressors. Back into line. Medieval villages, where social media shaming was analog and involved actual pitchforks. The economic reality of peasant life made adultery particularly complicated. In a world where survival often depended on household cooperation, and where property rights were fuzzy at best, adultery could literally threaten a family's ability to survive the next winter. A woman who bore children from an affair created questions about inheritance, labor obligations, and resource distribution that could destabilize entire communities. And yet, the actual evidence suggests that peasant adultery was remarkably common despite the harsh punishments. Medieval court records are filled with cases of peasant women accused of bearing children out of wedlock, peasant men caught with their neighbors' wives, and entire village communities torn apart by accusations of sexual impropriety. Either medieval peasants were remarkably bad at risk assessment, or the human drive for sexual expression was stronger than the fear of brutal punishment. Probably both. The merchant class, that emerging middle group between nobles and peasants, developed their own approaches to adultery that reflected their unique position in medieval society. Merchant wives were often left alone for months while their husbands traveled trade routes, creating both opportunity and suspicion. Merchant communities developed elaborate systems of surveillance and control, designed to protect their reputations and their business relationships. Merchant adultery cases often involved financial compensation rather than physical punishment, reflecting a class of people who understood that reputation and business relationships were more valuable than revenge. A merchant who discovered his wife's adultery might demand payment from her lover, not out of wounded pride, but as compensation for damaged business prospects. Medieval merchants, where even adultery was a business transaction. The clergy, supposedly celibate and above such earthly concerns, developed their own unique relationship with adultery law that was both hypocritical and pragmatic. Clerical adultery, or more accurately, clerical violation of celibacy vows, was technically a serious crime that could result in loss of position and excommunication. In practice, clerical sexual misbehavior was often handled quietly, with transfers to different parishes and financial penalties rather than public punishment. But when it came to punishing lay adultery, the church was often the driving force behind the harshest penalties. Church courts regularly ordered public penance, excommunication, and elaborate humiliation rituals for adulteresses, while somehow managing to overlook the sexual misbehavior of their own clergy. Medieval Christianity, where moral standards were, like medieval roads, full of holes and difficult to navigate. The regional variations in class-based adultery punishment were remarkable. In some parts of medieval Europe, noble adultery was handled through elaborate codes of honor that emphasized personal combat and ritual satisfaction. In others, it was treated as a political matter requiring diplomatic solution. Peasant adultery might result in death in one region and mere fines in another, depending on local customs, economic conditions, and the personal preferences of whoever happened to be in charge. Still, throughout all these regional and class-based variations, one thing remained constant: the fundamental assumption that adultery was primarily a crime against male property rights rather than a violation of mutual marital obligations. Whether you were a queen or a peasant, your adultery was ultimately judged not by how it affected you or even your spouse, but by how it threatened the social order that kept everyone in their proper place. Of course, this system created its own problems. A legal framework based on class privilege and gender inequality was bound to generate resentment, resistance, and creative attempts to work around the rules. Medieval literature is filled with stories of clever women outwitting their husbands, resourceful lovers finding ways around social barriers, and elaborate schemes to avoid the brutal consequences of getting caught. Let's be clear about something. Right from the start, the medieval Catholic Church didn't just disapprove of adultery. It basically declared war on it with the kind of systematic thoroughness that would make modern PR firms weep with envy. The Church viewed adultery as not just a personal failing or a social problem, but as a direct assault on the cosmic order itself, a rebellion against God that required immediate, public, and often brutal correction. The theological foundation for the Church's position on adultery was built on a fascinating combination of biblical interpretation, Roman legal tradition, and what can only be described as some seriously creative reasoning about the nature of marriage, sexuality, and divine will. According to church doctrine, marriage was a sacrament, one of only 7 sacred rituals that connected earthly life to divine grace. This meant that adultery wasn't just cheating on your spouse. It was desecrating a holy institution, and personally, insulting God himself. To be fair, the Church's position was internally consistent, even if it was also systematically oppressive. If marriage was a sacred reflection of Christ's relationship with the Church, then adultery was essentially a form of heresy. If sexual union within marriage was a divinely ordained blessing, then sexual union outside marriage was a diabolic corruption. The logic was airtight, even if the results were often horrifying. But here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely bonkers. The Church developed an elaborate system of sexual regulation that made modern bureaucracy look efficient. Church law didn't just prohibit adultery. It regulated every conceivable aspect of marital sexuality, from which days of the week were appropriate for sexual activity, not Sundays, obviously, to which positions were acceptable. Missionary only, thank you very much, to how couples should pray before and after sexual activity. Yes, really. Canon law, the legal code of the Catholic Church, treated adultery as both a sin requiring spiritual penance and a crime requiring legal punishment. This created a 2-track system where adulterers faced both ecclesiastical penalties, excommunication, public penance, spiritual counseling, and civil punishments that could include fines, imprisonment, physical punishment, or death. Medieval Christianity, where double jeopardy was a feature, not a bug. The Church's approach to punishing adultery was remarkably sophisticated in its psychological understanding of shame and social control. Public penance required adulterers to appear before their entire community, confess their sins in detail, and submit to ritualized humiliation designed to reinforce both their personal guilt and the community's moral standards. These weren't private conversations with a priest. They were community theater productions with the sinner as the unwilling star. Medieval penitential manuals, essentially guidebooks for priests dealing with various sins, contained elaborate instructions for handling adultery cases. Different types of adultery required different types of penance. A single incident with a stranger might require months of fasting and prayer, while an ongoing affair with a family member could result in years of public humiliation and social exile. The Church had basically created a comprehensive taxonomy of sexual sin with corresponding punishment protocols. Meanwhile, the Church's position on gender and adultery revealed the same double standards that characterized medieval secular law, but with added theological justification. Women were viewed as naturally more susceptible to sexual temptation. Thanks, Eve, and therefore required stricter supervision and harsher punishment when they strayed. Male adultery was certainly sinful, but female adultery was evidence of fundamental spiritual corruption that threatened the entire community. The concept of sanctuary provided an interesting wrinkle in church adultery law. A woman accused of adultery could seek sanctuary in a church where she would be protected from immediate secular punishment while church authorities investigated her case. In theory, this provided protection for women who might be falsely accused or facing disproportionate punishment. In practice, sanctuary often just delayed the inevitable while adding a layer of ecclesiastical approval to whatever brutal punishment was eventually imposed. And yet, the church's own clergy weren't exactly paragons of sexual virtue, creating a level of hypocrisy that would be hilarious if it weren't so destructive. Medieval church records are filled with cases of priests, monks, and even bishops conducting affairs, keeping concubines, and fathering children they couldn't legally acknowledge. The same institution that imposed brutal punishments on lay adultery routinely covered up clerical sexual misconduct with transfers, financial payments, and selective blindness. The development of confession as a sacrament created new opportunities for both sexual regulation and sexual abuse. The requirement that all Christians confess their sins to a priest at least once a year meant that the church had unprecedented access to information about private sexual behavior. Confession manuals from the period show that priests were trained to ask detailed questions about sexual activity, creating a surveillance system that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. But confession also created opportunities for clerical sexual abuse that the church was remarkably reluctant to address. Medieval records contain numerous accounts of priests using the confessional to extract sexual favors from female penitents, often under the threat of refusing absolution or imposing impossible penances. Medieval Christianity, where spiritual counseling sometimes came with a side of sexual coercion. The church's marriage laws created additional complications around adultery enforcement. The requirement that marriages be conducted in church and witnessed by clergy gave the church unprecedented control over who could marry whom, when they could marry, and under what circumstances marriages could be dissolved. This power was often used to punish adultery retroactively, declaring marriages invalid after adultery was discovered, legitimizing children born from affairs, or forcing adulterous couples into arranged marriages. Ecclesiastical courts, the church's parallel legal system, handled most adultery cases throughout medieval Europe. These courts operated under different rules of evidence, different concepts of justice, and different ideas about appropriate punishment than secular courts. The result was a legal maze where the same act of adultery might be treated as a minor infraction by one court and a capital crime by another, depending on which jurisdiction happened to claim authority. The church's relationship with secular authorities created ongoing tension around adultery punishment. Church leaders wanted to maintain their authority over marriage and sexual morality, while kings and nobles wanted to control their own subjects and protect their own interests. The result was a constant power struggle where adultery cases became proxy battles for larger questions about political and religious authority. To be fair, the church did develop some innovative approaches to adultery prevention that went beyond simple punishment. Marriage counseling, spiritual direction, and community support systems all emerged from church efforts to strengthen marriages and reduce the likelihood of adultery. The problem was that these preventive measures were usually overwhelmed by the punitive systems designed to punish adultery after it occurred. The impact of church adultery law extended far beyond individual cases to shape medieval attitudes about sexuality, gender, and social order. The Church's systematic demonization of female sexuality created cultural patterns that persisted for centuries, while its emphasis on public punishment and community shaming reinforced social hierarchies and power structures that served ecclesiastical interests. Still, the Church's approach to adultery wasn't uniformly harsh or consistently applied. Regional variations, political pressures, and individual clerical attitudes created a system where identical cases might be handled very differently depending on circumstances. A wealthy donor's adultery might be handled with discretion and minimal punishment, while a poor peasant's identical behavior could result in public humiliation and social exile. Of course, the ultimate irony of the Church's war on adultery was that it probably didn't actually reduce adultery rates. Medieval literature, court records, and popular culture all suggest that adultery remained remarkably common throughout the medieval period, despite increasingly harsh punishments and elaborate surveillance systems. Apparently, the human capacity for sexual transgression was stronger than medieval Christianity's capacity for sexual regulation. If you thought medieval people lacked imagination, you clearly haven't spent much time studying their approach to punishing adultery. These were people who turned creative cruelty into an art form, developing punishment methods so specifically tailored to sexual transgression that they basically created entire industries around marital revenge. We're talking about a civilization that looked at the basic concept of making someone suffer for their sexual choices and said, "Hold my ale, I've got some ideas." Let's start with one of the most widespread and psychologically sophisticated punishments, the adulterous walk of shame, but medieval style. The carting punishment, popular throughout medieval England, required the guilty woman to be stripped to her undergarments, placed in a cart, and paraded through the community while locals pelted her with rotten vegetables, animal waste, and whatever other charming projectiles they had handy. But here's the really creative part. The route was carefully planned to pass by every significant location in her life: her family's home, her workplace, her church, and of course, the scene of her alleged crime. Medieval communities didn't just want to punish adulteresses. They wanted to create a public spectacle that would be remembered for years and serve as a warning to anyone else considering similar behavior. The rough music or chivalry tradition took this even further, organizing elaborate community performances where neighbors would gather outside the adulterer's house to sing insulting songs, bang pots and pans, and generally make life unbearable, until the offender either left town or died of shame. Medieval Europe, where cancel culture involved actual music and significantly more cow dung. To be fair, some communities developed punishments that were more psychologically sophisticated than physically brutal, though that doesn't necessarily make them less cruel. The Schandmask or shame mask tradition in Germanic regions required adulteresses to wear elaborate metal masks designed to both humiliate and physically torment. These weren't just simple face coverings. They were carefully crafted devices, featuring exaggerated facial features, animal characteristics, or obscene symbols that broadcast the wearer's crime to anyone who saw them. The shame masks were often designed with specific features that made normal activities impossible: metal tongues that prevented speech, extended snouts that made eating difficult, or elaborate horn configurations that made it impossible to pass through doorways without assistance. Medieval Germanic communities, where they literally redesigned human anatomy to maximize humiliation. But wait, it gets worse. The branks, or scold's bridle, popular in Scotland and northern England, was a metal contraption that enclosed the entire head and featured a metal bit that was inserted into the mouth, preventing the wearer from speaking while often causing painful injuries to the tongue and teeth. Women convicted of adultery might be sentenced to wear the branks for days or weeks while performing community service or simply enduring public mockery. Meanwhile, in medieval France, communities developed a delightfully specific punishment: of amende honorable, which required adulterers to appear in public wearing only a simple shift, carrying a candle, and verbally confessing their sins in elaborate detail while requesting forgiveness from God, their spouse, and the community. The confession had to follow specific linguistic formulas and include graphic descriptions of the transgression, essentially forcing the guilty party to provide pornographic entertainment while being ritually humiliated. The Italian city-states, never to be outdone in matters of creative cruelty, developed some of the most elaborate adultery punishments in medieval Europe. Venetian law required adulteresses to be publicly whipped while being paraded between the columns of St. Mark's Square, then branded with specific symbols that identified their crime. But Venetian creativity didn't stop there. Repeat offenders could face increasingly bizarre punishments, including forced prostitution, public display in specially designed cages, or exile to remote islands where they would be abandoned with minimal supplies. And yet, perhaps the most psychologically cruel punishment was the medieval practice of divorce by combat, where a woman's adultery accusation could be resolved through trial by combat between her accuser and her champion. If no one was willing to fight for her honor, or if her champion lost, she was considered guilty regardless of the actual evidence. Medieval justice, where your innocence depended on your friend's sword-fighting skills. The Germanic legal tradition of mourning gift created another uniquely cruel punishment for adultery. When a woman was convicted of adultery, her husband could reclaim all the property and gifts he had given her during their marriage, leaving her destitute and socially isolated. But the really creative part was that the husband could also demand compensation from his wife's family for the damaged goods they had provided him with, essentially turning adultery into a commercial transaction with penalties for false advertising. Some regions developed punishments that were designed to be both temporary torment and permanent identification. The practice of branding adulteresses with specific symbols, often the letter A, or crude representations of genitalia, served multiple purposes: immediate physical punishment, permanent identification of their crime, and ongoing social ostracism. These weren't subtle marks that could be easily hidden. They were deliberately placed on visible areas like the forehead, cheek, or breast to ensure maximum social impact. But here's where medieval creativity really shined: the development of punishment devices so specifically designed for adultery that they serve no other conceivable purpose. The Judas chair, used in some Germanic regions, was a pyramid-shaped wooden device onto which convicted adulteresses were slowly lowered, causing increasing pain and injury. The device was often used in public squares, where community members could watch the punishment unfold over hours or even days. The Spanish spider, or breast ripper, was exactly what it sounds like: a metal claw device used to mutilate women convicted of adultery, sexual impropriety, or other crimes against marital fidelity. The device was specifically designed to destroy breast tissue while keeping the victim alive and conscious, creating both immediate agony and permanent disfigurement. Medieval Spain, where they literally invented tools to destroy the physical symbols of femininity. Meanwhile, the practice of cucking stool punishment subjected adulteresses to ritualized dunking in rivers, ponds, or specially constructed water tanks while being pelted with objects and subjected to verbal abuse from gathered crowds. The dunking was carefully calibrated to be terrifying and humiliating without quite causing death, though many victims suffered permanent injury or illness. From the experience, sound familiar? Well, maybe not the specific medieval part, but the human capacity for turning public shaming into community entertainment certainly resonates today, just with different technology and fewer actual torture devices. Of course, male adulterers weren't entirely exempt from creative punishment, though their treatment was generally less physically brutal and more focused on financial penalties and social humiliation. The practice of horns, literally attaching animal horns to the head of a cuckold. Husband was sometimes applied to cheating husbands as well, though usually in less permanent and more ceremonial ways. The pillory of love in some French regions required male adulterers to stand in public stocks while community members recited their romantic failings in verse form. The punishment was designed to be humiliating rather than physically harmful, reflecting the different standards applied to male versus female sexual transgression. Medieval gender equality, where even public humiliation came with different terms and conditions. Still, some regions developed creative punishments for male adultery that were genuinely innovative in their psychological sophistication. The cuckold's procession required cheating husbands to parade through their communities, wearing signs describing their infidelity, followed by musicians playing mocking songs about their romantic failures. The punishment was designed to destroy masculine honor through ridicule rather than physical violence. The regional variations in creative adultery punishment were remarkable, suggesting that medieval communities approached marital transgression with the same innovative spirit they brought to cathedral architecture or military engineering. Each region seemed determined to develop its own unique approach to making adulterers suffer in ways that reflected local values, available materials, and cultural traditions. The economic dimensions of creative punishment reveal how communities turned adultery enforcement into profitable enterprises. Public punishments often involved fees paid to executioners, guards, and other officials, while the sale of rotten vegetables and other projectiles for crowd participation created informal economies around adultery spectacles. Some communities essentially turned adultery punishment into entertainment industries that generated revenue while reinforcing social order. And yet, for all their creativity and cruelty, these punishments were remarkably ineffective at actually preventing adultery. Medieval records suggest that adultery rates remained fairly constant throughout the period, despite increasingly elaborate and brutal punishment systems. Either medieval people were remarkably optimistic about their chances of avoiding detection, or the human drive for sexual expression was stronger than the fear of creative torture. Probably both. The legacy of these creative punishments extended far beyond their immediate victims to shape medieval attitudes about sexuality, gender, and social control. The public nature of most adultery punishments reinforced community bonds, while simultaneously demonstrating the consequences of stepping outside accepted social boundaries. They were, in essence, participatory theater productions with real stakes and permanent consequences. That's right. Medieval communities, essentially, invented reality television centuries before anyone thought of putting cameras in people's bedrooms. The difference was that medieval reality shows ended with actual pain, permanent disfigurement, and social death, rather than just temporary embarrassment and 15 minutes of fame. Of course, the very existence of such elaborate punishment systems suggests that medieval communities were deeply anxious about sexual transgression and struggling to maintain social order in the face of persistent human desires that refused to conform to legal and religious requirements. The more creative the punishment, the more desperate the attempt to control behavior that seemed fundamentally uncontrollable. The technological ingenuity displayed in medieval punishment devices reveals a civilization that could design complex mechanical systems when properly motivated by the desire to inflict systematic suffering. The same engineering principles that built medieval cathedrals and siege engines were applied to creating devices specifically designed to torture adulterers in precisely calibrated ways. Meanwhile, the community participation aspects of these punishments reveal how societies use collective violence to reinforce social bonds and shared values. By making adultery punishment a community activity, medieval societies ensured that everyone participated in enforcing sexual morality while simultaneously entertaining themselves at the expense of transgressors. Medieval social media where the mob was literal and the consequences were permanent. Let's be honest about the psychological sophistication behind some of these punishment methods. Medieval communities understood trauma and humiliation in ways that would impress modern behavioral psychologists. The wheel of shame, used in some German territories, wasn't just about physical discomfort. It was designed to create maximum psychological impact by forcing adulteresses to be displayed at varying heights throughout the day, ensuring that their humiliation was visible from different vantage points across the community. The victim's perspective would constantly shift, making them aware of being observed from all angles while preventing them from mentally adapting to a single position. The infamous drunkard's cloak was adapted specifically for adultery cases. In northern English communities, requiring offenders to wear a wooden barrow with holes cut for their head and arms while walking through town. But the adultery version included specific modifications. Additional holes that allowed community members to poke the victim with sticks, small bells attached to make noise with every movement, and often obscene drawings painted on the barrel that graphically depicted the accused crime. Medieval England, where public humiliation came with both visual and auditory components, thought to be fair. Some communities developed punishment rituals that were more elaborate performance art than simple torture. The adultery pageant tradition, in parts of medieval France, required the entire community to participate in elaborate theatrical productions where the adultery was reenacted using actors, with the guilty parties forced to watch their transgressions performed as crude comedy. These pageants could last for days and often involved increasingly elaborate costumes, musical numbers, and dramatic interpretations that turned personal tragedy into community entertainment. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated punishment was the mirror penance, used in some Italian city-states, where convicted adulteresses were required to spend hours each day staring at their reflection in polished metal mirrors while reciting confessions of their unworthiness. The punishment was designed to destroy self-esteem and internalize shame, creating psychological damage that would persist long after the physical aspects of punishment ended. Medieval Italy, where they understood that destroying someone's self-image was more effective than destroying their body. The development of adultery guilds in some Germanic regions created professional organizations dedicated specifically to developing and implementing creative punishments for sexual transgressions. These guilds maintained detailed records of punishment methods, shared innovations across communities, and essentially created medieval quality control systems for ensuring that adultery punishments met established standards of creativity and effectiveness. Medieval Germany, where even revenge was organized into professional associations. And yet, some of the most creative punishments involved manipulating social relationships rather than inflicting physical pain. The reconciliation ceremony used in parts of medieval Spain forced adulteresses to publicly apologize not just to their husbands, but to every member of their extended families, their neighbors, their employers, and even their children's teachers. The ceremony could take days to complete and required specific ritual gestures, verbal formulas, and symbolic offerings to each person wronged by the adultery. Medieval Spain, where saying sorry was a full-time job, the phenomenon of adultery markets in some regions created economic opportunities around punishment that revealed the entrepreneurial spirit of medieval communities. Vendors would sell specialized items for pelting adulterers during public punishments, including rotten eggs marked with insulting messages, specially designed noisemakers for disrupting their sleep, and even custom-made masks for spectators who wanted to participate anonymously. Some entrepreneurs developed portable punishment devices that could be rented for private revenge ceremonies. Meanwhile, the practice of sympathetic punishment in Celtic regions extended adultery penalties to family members, friends, and even neighbors who had failed to prevent or report the transgression. A woman's adultery might result in her sister being required to wear shame symbols, her mother losing market privileges, and her friends facing social ostracism until they could prove their ignorance of the affair. Celtic justice, where guilt was a community responsibility and punishment was a family affair. The seasonal variations in punishment creativity reveal how medieval communities adapted their cruelty to local conditions and cultural rhythms. Winter. Punishments often involved exposure to cold weather as an additional element of suffering, while summer punishments might include forced labor during the hottest parts of the day. Some communities developed special punishment rituals for religious holidays that combined seasonal celebrations with adultery enforcement, creating festival atmospheres around systematic humiliation. The international exchange of punishment methods created a medieval network of creative cruelty that spread innovations across political boundaries. Communities would send representatives to observe punishment techniques in other regions, leading to cross-cultural pollination of torture methods that combined local traditions with foreign innovations. A punishment technique developed in Germanic regions might be adapted and refined in Italian city-states, then exported to English communities with additional modifications. Still, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval punishment creativity was its complete failure to achieve its stated goals. Despite centuries of increasingly elaborate and brutal punishment systems, adultery remained common throughout medieval Europe. The creative energy invested in developing new forms of torture and humiliation might have been better spent addressing the underlying social conditions that made adultery attractive or inevitable. But medieval communities consistently chose punishment over prevention. The documentation of these punishment methods in medieval legal codes, court records, and literary sources reveals communities that were obsessed with cataloging and perfecting their approaches to sexual control. Some regions maintained detailed punishment libraries with illustrated guides to different torture techniques, user manuals for operating complex punishment devices, and even comparative studies of effectiveness across different methods. Of course, the gender disparities in punishment creativity remained consistent across all regions and time periods. While women faced increasingly elaborate physical and psychological torture for adultery, men's punishments remained focused on financial penalties, temporary social embarrassment, and symbolic gestures that rarely caused permanent harm. This disparity wasn't accidental. It reflected fundamental assumptions about gender, property, and social order that prioritized male authority over female autonomy. The legacy of medieval punishment creativity shaped attitudes toward justice, retribution, and social control that persisted long after the specific torture devices were abandoned. The assumption that public humiliation was an appropriate response to private transgression, that community participation in punishment strengthened social bonds, and that creative cruelty could deter undesirable behavior all became embedded in Western legal and cultural traditions. And yet, the ultimate irony of all this creative energy devoted to punishment is that it probably made adultery more attractive rather than less. The elaborate attention paid to sexual transgression, the detailed public discussions of specific acts during punishment ceremonies, and the community-wide focus on sexual behavior likely served to normalize and even romanticize adultery rather than prevent it. Medieval communities, where the cure was worse than the disease, and probably caused more of the disease. Let's be clear about something that medieval men would have preferred to keep quiet. Being cuckolded in medieval society wasn't just personally humiliating. It was a form of social death that could destroy a man's reputation, his political prospects, and his economic standing faster than a plague outbreak in a crowded marketplace. The medieval concept of masculine honor was so tightly bound to sexual control over women that a man whose wife committed adultery was seen as fundamentally failing at the basic requirements of manhood. The word cuckold itself comes from the cuckoo bird, whose females were believed to lay their eggs in other birds' nests, forcing unsuspecting males to raise offspring that weren't their own. Medieval men lived in constant terror of becoming human cuckoos, raising children who didn't share their blood while everyone around them snickered behind their backs. Sound familiar? Well, maybe not the medieval part, but the anxiety about paternity certainly resonates across the centuries. Medieval masculine honor operated on a simple but devastating principle. A man who couldn't control his own wife was clearly incapable of controlling anything else. This wasn't just personal reputation. It was a fundamental assessment of a man's fitness for leadership, business relationships, political authority, and social respect. A cuckold wasn't just a man with an unfaithful wife. He was a failed man whose very presence contaminated other men with the possibility of similar failure. To be fair, medieval society did provide men with legal remedies for adultery that were both comprehensive and brutal. A husband who caught his wife in adultery could legally kill both her and her lover in most medieval jurisdictions. And this wasn't considered murder. It was considered justified defense of property rights. Medieval law, where domestic violence was technically property maintenance. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean psychologically twisted. While medieval law gave men extensive rights to punish adultery, actually exercising those rights often made the situation worse rather than better. A man who killed his adulterous wife might satisfy his honor in the short term, but he also eliminated his chance of producing legitimate heirs and often triggered blood feuds with his wife's family that could last for generations. The concept of trial by combat provided an alternative to immediate violence that was somehow both more civilized and more brutal. A husband who suspected his wife of adultery could demand that her alleged lover face him in single combat, with the outcome determining guilt or innocence. This system theoretically provided due process while practically ensuring that adultery accusations would be resolved through violence regardless of actual guilt or innocence. Medieval justice, where your innocence depended on your sword skills. Medieval literature reveals fascinating insights into men's psychological experience of cuckoldry, though much of it is filtered through literary conventions that may not reflect actual experience. The figure of the foolish, oblivious cuckold became a standard character in medieval comedy, suggesting that the fear of being cuckolded was so universal that audiences found humor in seeing it happen to others. Medieval entertainment, where other people's marital disasters were comedy gold. The economic implications of female adultery created additional pressures for medieval men beyond simple questions of honor and reputation. In a world where inheritance and property rights were determined by legitimate bloodlines, a woman's adultery could literally destroy her husband's economic future and that of his entire family line. Children born from adultery might have claims on family property, while legitimate children might find their inheritance rights questioned if their mother's fidelity was in doubt. And yet, medieval men were often complicit in creating the conditions that made adultery more likely through their own sexual behavior and marriage practices. Men who spent months or years away on military campaigns, trading expeditions, or pilgrimage created opportunities for their wives to seek emotional and sexual fulfillment elsewhere. Men who married much younger women for political or economic reasons shouldn't have been surprised when those women sought more compatible partners. The practice of arranged marriage created a particularly cruel situation for medieval men, though they were rarely willing to acknowledge it. A man who married a woman he had never met, who had no emotional connection to him, and who had been forced into the marriage against her will, was essentially setting himself up for adultery. But instead of questioning the marriage system itself, medieval society blamed women for failing to honor contracts they had no role in negotiating. Medieval concepts of friendship and loyalty among men were complicated by adultery in ways that created ongoing social tension. A man whose friend seduced his wife faced a double betrayal that challenged fundamental assumptions about masculine bonds and social relationships. The legal remedies available, trial by combat, blood feuds, financial compensation, often destroyed the very social networks that men depended on for survival and prosperity. The role of servants, apprentices, and other dependent men in facilitating adultery created additional complications for medieval masculinity. A master who discovered that his wife was conducting an affair with one of his own servants faced not just sexual betrayal, but a fundamental challenge to his authority and competence. The punishment for such betrayal was often brutal: public execution, mutilation, or exile. But the damage to the master's reputation was often permanent regardless of how severely the transgression was punished. Meanwhile, the Church's teaching about forgiveness and reconciliation created theological tensions around masculine responses to adultery. Christian doctrine technically required men to forgive their wives' adultery and work toward reconciliation, but medieval masculine honor demanded revenge and punishment. Most men resolved this tension by ignoring church teaching and following social expectations, though some struggled with genuine religious conviction that conflicted with cultural pressure. The phenomenon of professional cuckolds, men who were widely known to tolerate their wives' adultery in exchange for social or economic benefits, reveals the complex negotiations that sometimes developed around medieval marriage and sexuality. These men sacrificed masculine honor for practical advantages, accepting social humiliation in exchange for access to powerful patrons, lucrative business relationships, or political protection. Perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of medieval masculine experience with adultery was the way it forced men to confront their own sexual behavior and moral contradictions. Medieval men routinely engaged in extramarital sex with prostitutes, servants, and unmarried women, while demanding absolute fidelity from their wives. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this double standard created psychological stress that manifested in various forms of violence, paranoia, and social dysfunction. The legal doctrine of flagrant adultery, catching someone in the bind act, created additional psychological pressure for medieval men by essentially requiring them to become spies and investigators in their own homes. Men who suspected their wives of adultery were expected to gather evidence, set traps, and document transgressions in ways that turned marriage into a form of surveillance operation. Medieval marriage, where love was optional but detective work was required. Still, some medieval men developed more sophisticated approaches to dealing with adultery that went beyond simple violence and revenge. Financial settlements, arranged separations, and negotiated reconciliations all appear in medieval records, suggesting that some men were able to navigate adultery crises with pragmatic creativity rather than blind adherence to honor codes. The regional variations in masculine responses to adultery were remarkable, reflecting different cultural values and legal traditions across medieval Europe. Mediterranean cultures tended to emphasize violent revenge and blood feuds, while Northern European cultures developed more elaborate systems of financial compensation and ritual satisfaction. Germanic traditions emphasized trial by combat and personal confrontation, while Celtic cultures sometimes incorporated community mediation and collective decision-making. Of course, the actual evidence suggests that medieval men were often remarkably bad at detecting their wives' adultery despite their elaborate surveillance efforts and legal remedies. Medieval literature is filled with stories of oblivious husbands who remain unaware of obvious affairs, suggesting either that medieval women were remarkably skilled at deception or that medieval men were remarkably unskilled at detection. Probably both thought. The class-based variations in masculine responses to adultery created additional social tensions and contradictions. Noblemen were expected to respond to adultery with elaborate displays of honor and revenge. All peasant men were expected to handle adultery quietly and efficiently without disrupting agricultural production. Merchantmen developed their own approaches that emphasize financial calculation and business relationships over traditional honor codes. The phenomenon of adultery tourism. Men traveling to other regions specifically to engage in extramarital affairs created a form of masculine hypocrisy that was widely practiced but rarely acknowledged. Men who demanded absolute fidelity from their wives while conducting their own affairs in distant locations created moral contradictions that undermined the very honor codes they claimed to uphold. And yet, for all their legal rights and social privileges, medieval men often found themselves as trapped by adultery expectations as their wives, though in different ways. The pressure to respond violently to adultery, to maintain impossible standards of honor, and to control behavior that was fundamentally uncontrollable created psychological stress that manifested in various forms of social dysfunction and personal misery. The legacy of medieval masculine attitudes toward adultery shaped concepts of honor, masculinity, and sexual control that persisted long after the medieval period ended. The fundamental assumption that masculine worth was determined by sexual control over women became deeply embedded in Western culture, creating patterns of behavior and expectation that continue to influence gender relationships today. If you thought medieval Europe had a unified approach to anything, you clearly haven't spent much time studying medieval politics, where every kingdom, duchy, and city-state seemed determined to develop its own unique approach to absolutely everything, including how to brutally punish people for sleeping with the wrong person. The regional variations in adultery punishment across medieval Europe were so dramatic that you could literally walk from one valley to the next and find yourself subject to completely different penalties for identical behavior. Let's start with medieval England, where they developed what can only be described as a magnificently bureaucratic approach to adultery punishment that somehow managed to be both systematic and completely arbitrary. English common law, as it evolved through the medieval period, created elaborate procedures for investigating adultery accusations, including formal inquiries, witness testimony, and evidence collection that would make modern legal scholars weep with appreciation for due process. The catch? All this careful procedure usually led to brutal public punishments that made the Spanish Inquisition look gentle. The famous English practice of carting required convicted adulteresses to be paraded through their communities on ox carts, while locals pelted them with whatever disgusting projectiles they could find. But English creativity didn't stop there. They also developed the cucking stool, a specially designed chair that could be repeatedly dunked into rivers or ponds, while the victim was strapped in place. Medieval England, where they engineered elaborate devices specifically for marital revenge. To be fair, the English also developed some of the most sophisticated legal protections for women accused of adultery, including the right to sanctuary in churches, formal appeals processes, and even early forms of legal representation. Of course, these protections were often overwhelmed by social pressure and political convenience, but they existed on paper, which was more than most medieval jurisdictions could claim. Meanwhile, across the Channel, medieval France was developing its own distinctly French approach to adultery that somehow managed to be both more refined and more sadistic than English methods. French customary law emphasized public humiliation over physical punishment, creating elaborate rituals of shame that were designed to destroy social standing rather than simply inflict pain. The amende honorable required adulteresses to appear in public wearing only simple shifts, carrying candles, and reciting detailed confessions of their sexual transgressions. But French creativity reached its peak with the development of chivalry, community-organized festivals of humiliation that could last for days or weeks. Entire villages would participate in elaborate performances designed to mock and torment adulterers, featuring music, costumes, theatrical presentations, and community participation that turned adultery punishment into a form of participatory entertainment. Medieval France, where public shaming was performance art. The Germanic regions developed perhaps the most systematically brutal approaches to adultery punishment, reflecting cultural values that emphasize personal combat, blood, revenge, and elaborate concepts of honor that made Mediterranean vendettas look like polite disagreements. Germanic law codes gave husbands extensive rights to kill adulterous wives and their lovers, but they also developed complex systems of financial compensation that allowed wronged husbands to accept payment instead of blood. The Germanic mourning Givet tradition created particularly cruel possibilities for adultery punishment. When a woman was convicted of adultery, her husband could reclaim all the property and gifts he had given her during their marriage, effectively leaving her destitute and socially isolated. But Germanic creativity didn't stop there. They also developed elaborate shame punishments involving specially designed masks, public displays, and community rituals that could permanently mark adulterers as social outcasts. And yet, Germanic law also included some surprisingly sophisticated protections for accused adulterers, including formal trial procedures, evidence requirements, and even early forms of legal counsel. The problem was that these protections were often overwhelmed by cultural pressure for immediate revenge and blood satisfaction. Spanish medieval law, heavily influenced by both Roman legal tradition and Islamic legal concepts from the period of Moorish rule, created some of the most elaborate and specific adultery statutes in medieval Europe. The Siete Partidas, compiled in the 13th century, dedicated extensive sections to defining exactly what constituted adultery, who could accuse whom, what evidence was acceptable, and what punishments were appropriate for different social classes and circumstances. Spanish adultery law was remarkably sophisticated in its recognition of different types of sexual transgression and appropriate responses to each. Simple adultery might result in fines and public penance, while aggravated adultery, involving family members, clergy, or multiple partners, could result in death, mutilation, or permanent exile. Spanish law also developed elaborate procedures for handling adultery accusations involving nobility, clergy, and foreign nationals, creating a legal framework that took into account the complex political realities of medieval Spanish society. But Spanish innovation in adultery punishment extended beyond legal sophistication to creative cruelty that made other regions look merciful by comparison. The Spanish spider or breast ripper was exactly what it sounds like, a metal claw device specifically designed to mutilate women convicted of adultery. Spanish law also included provisions for forced prostitution, public display, and specially designed cages, and exile to remote locations where survival was unlikely. Italian city-states developed their own unique approaches that reflected the complex political and economic realities of medieval Italian society. Venice, with its extensive maritime trading relationships, created legal codes that took into account the reality that husbands might be away for months or years at a time. Venetian law recognized different categories of adultery based on circumstances, duration, and the social status of the participants, creating a nuanced approach that was unusual for the medieval period. Florence, always competing with Venice for sophistication and innovation, developed even more elaborate legal frameworks that included provisions for love potions, financial compensation for damaged reputations, and complex inheritance questions involving children born from adulterous relationships. Florentine law also recognized the right of accused adulterers to formal legal representation and appeal processes, though these rights were often limited by social class and political connections. Meanwhile, The Papal States developed their own approaches that blended canon law with secular legal tradition in ways that were often contradictory and always politically motivated. Adultery cases involving clergy, nobility, or foreign nationals could become complex, diplomatic situations that required careful negotiation between religious and secular authorities. Scandinavian regions developed adultery laws that reflected the harsh realities of survival in challenging climates and isolated communities. Norwegian and Danish law emphasized community stability over individual punishment, creating systems where adultery was often handled through negotiated settlements, arranged marriages, and financial compensation rather than brutal physical punishment. The reasoning was practical. Destroying community members through violent punishment could threaten the survival of entire settlements during harsh winters or difficult economic periods. Still, Scandinavian communities weren't exactly gentle in their approach to adultery. The practice of knitting, ritualized social ostracism, could effectively destroy someone's ability to survive in isolated communities where cooperation was essential for survival. Being declared needing meant losing access to community support, trading relationships, and social networks that could mean the difference between life and death during long, harsh winters. The Celtic regions of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales developed their own approaches that blended pre-Christian traditions with Christian legal concepts in ways that often confused contemporary observers and continued to puzzle modern historians. Celtic law recognized complex kinship relationships that made adultery accusations particularly complicated, since sexual relationships that might be considered adulterous in other regions were sometimes acceptable within Celtic kinship systems. But Celtic adultery law also included some of the most creative punishments in medieval Europe, including ritualized combat between women, complex financial compensation systems that could bankrupt entire families, and elaborate shame rituals that could last for years. Celtic communities also developed sophisticated mediation systems that attempted to resolve adultery disputes without destroying the social relationships essential for community survival. The Eastern European regions developed their own approaches that reflected the complex interactions between Slavic traditions, Byzantine legal influence, and ongoing contact with nomadic cultures. Polish and Hungarian adultery law emphasized royal authority and centralized control, creating systems where adultery punishment served political purposes beyond simple justice or social control. Of course, the practical reality of regional variation meant that identical acts of adultery could result in wildly different punishments, depending on which side of a political boundary they occurred. A woman who committed adultery in one kingdom might face death, while the same act in a neighboring duchy might result in nothing more than a fine and public penance. This created opportunities for adultery tourism, where people could potentially escape harsh punishment by fleeing to more lenient jurisdictions. The enforcement of these regional variations was complicated by the political realities of medieval Europe, where boundaries were constantly shifting. Authority was often disputed, and legal jurisdiction could change depending on political circumstances. Adultery cases could become complex diplomatic situations when they involved people from different regions or when accused adulterers fled across political boundaries. And yet, despite all these regional variations, certain common themes persisted. Across medieval Europe, the assumption that adultery was primarily a crime against male property rights, the belief that female adultery was more serious than male adultery, and the conviction that public punishment was necessary to maintain social order. These fundamental assumptions provided a common foundation even when specific punishments varied dramatically from region to region. Let's be clear about something that medieval moralists preferred to keep quiet. Adultery in medieval Europe wasn't primarily about love, lust, or even personal morality. It was about money, big money. The kind of money that could destabilize kingdoms, destroy family fortunes, and turn inheritance disputes into generational warfare that made modern corporate battles look like friendly disagreements over lunch. Plans. Medieval adultery was essentially a form of economic warfare conducted in bedrooms instead of boardrooms. The foundation of medieval economics was land ownership, and land ownership was determined by bloodlines, and bloodlines were guaranteed by female sexual fidelity. This created a system where a woman's adultery could literally redistribute wealth on a massive scale, turning bastard children into legitimate heirs and legitimate heirs into dispossessed bastards with the stroke of a quill pen or a swing of a sword. Medieval economics, where paternity tests were conducted with executioner's axes thought to be fair. The medieval obsession with legitimate bloodlines wasn't just about abstract concepts of purity or honor. It was about preventing economic chaos. In a world where most wealth was tied up in land that couldn't be easily divided, sold, or transferred, inheritance disputes could destroy entire family fortunes and destabilize entire regions. A single case of disputed paternity could trigger legal battles that lasted for generations and consumed resources that might otherwise have been used for agricultural improvement, trade development, or military defense. The dowry system created additional economic complications around adultery that turned marriage into a complex financial transaction with built-in penalties for breach of contract. When a woman brought property, money, or valuable connections to her marriage through her dowry, her adultery could void those contributions and trigger massive financial penalties for her family. Medieval marriage, where breach of contract could bankrupt your entire extended family. But here's where it gets really twisted. The same economic systems that made adultery so financially dangerous also created powerful incentives for adultery accusations, both true and false. A husband who wanted to escape a financially disadvantageous marriage could use adultery accusations to void his wife's dowry rights and reclaim property he had transferred to her family. A man who wanted to acquire his neighbor's land could seduce the neighbor's wife, then use the resulting scandal to claim financial compensation or property rights. Medieval inheritance law created particularly perverse incentives around adultery because it was based on the assumption that legitimate children had absolute priority over illegitimate children in inheritance matters. This meant that a single act of adultery could completely redistribute family wealth, turning wealthy heirs into penniless bastards and elevating bastard children to positions of economic power. The stakes were so high that some families invested enormous resources in monitoring, controlling, and sometimes falsely accusing women of adultery to protect their economic interests. The practice of legitimization, where illegitimate children could be declared legitimate through papal decree, royal proclamation, or formal legal procedures, created a medieval economy around adultery that would make modern lobbyists envious. Wealthy families routinely paid enormous bribes to church officials, royal courts, and legal authorities to legitimize their illegitimate children or delegitimize their rivals' legitimate children. Medieval Europe, where paternity was a commodity that could be bought and sold like any other valuable good. And yet, the economic incentives around adultery weren't limited to inheritance disputes. Medieval trade relationships, political alliances, and military agreements were often secured through marriage contracts that included specific penalties for adultery. A merchant who discovered his wife's adultery might lose not just his personal honor, but also his access to crucial trading partnerships, credit relationships, and business networks that depended on his family's reputation for reliability and trustworthiness. The concept of honor debt created additional economic pressures around adultery that turned personal relationships into financial obligations. A man whose wife committed adultery was often expected to provide financial compensation to his wife's family for the damage to their reputation, to his wife's lover's family for the disruption caused by revenge or punishment, and to his own family for the loss of honor and social standing. Medieval adultery, where the emotional cost was literally calculated in cash. Meanwhile, the church developed its own economic interests around adultery that created profitable business opportunities for ecclesiastical courts, legal scholars, and religious authorities. Adultery cases required extensive investigation, formal proceedings, expert testimony, and elaborate punishment rituals that generated significant income for church officials. Annulment proceedings, often triggered by adultery accusations, could be enormously expensive, requiring payments to multiple church authorities and often involving complex negotiations about property division and financial settlements. The phenomenon of adultery insurance, where families made financial arrangements to protect themselves against the economic consequences of adultery accusations, reveals the extent to which medieval society treated sexual transgression as a predictable business risk. Wealthy families routinely set aside funds to pay for legal defense, financial compensation, or alternative arrangements if family members were accused of adultery. Some families even negotiated formal agreements with their marriage partners, families about how adultery accusations would be handled financially. But perhaps the most economically significant aspect of medieval adultery was its role in property transfer between social classes. Adultery relationships between nobles and commoners could result in massive wealth transfers when illegitimate children were acknowledged and provided for. A peasant woman who bore a noble's illegitimate child might receive land grants, financial support, or elevated social status that could transform her family's economic circumstances for generations. The practice of beneficial adultery, where families deliberately encouraged adultery relationships that might result in economic advantage, reveals the extent to which medieval society was willing to sacrifice moral principles for financial gain. Families sometimes encouraged their daughters to conduct affairs with wealthy or powerful men in hopes of securing financial support, social advancement, or political protection. Medieval economics, where sexual morality was negotiable if the price was right. Still, the economic consequences of adultery weren't always predictable or controllable, creating financial risks that could destroy even wealthy families. A single adultery scandal could trigger cascading economic consequences, including lost business relationships, damaged credit, expensive legal proceedings, and retaliatory actions by affected families. Some medieval families were completely destroyed economically by adultery scandals that spiraled out of control. The regional variations in adultery economics were remarkable, reflecting different legal systems, economic structures, and cultural values across medieval Europe. Italian city-states developed sophisticated financial instruments for managing adultery risks, while Germanic regions emphasized land-based compensation systems. Mediterranean cultures often relied on complex honor debts and blood payments, while Northern European regions developed more formalized legal and financial procedures. The international implications of adultery economics created diplomatic complications that could affect relationships between kingdoms and trading partners. Adultery cases involving foreign nationals, international marriages, or cross-border property rights often required complex negotiations between different legal systems and political authorities. Some adultery scandals became significant diplomatic incidents that affected trade relationships, military alliances, and international law. Of course, the economic impact of adultery extended beyond individual families to affect entire communities and regions. A major adultery scandal involving important local families could disrupt agricultural production, interfere with trade relationships, and destabilize local political arrangements. Some medieval communities developed formal procedures for containing the economic damage from adultery scandals, including mediation systems, financial compensation pools, and community-based resolution mechanisms. The tax implications of adultery were particularly complex because illegitimate children had different legal status than legitimate children, affecting everything from inheritance taxes to military service obligations to church tithes. Tax collectors had to develop sophisticated procedures for determining paternity, legitimacy, and property rights in cases involving adultery accusations or illegitimate children. And yet, despite all these economic complications and risks, medieval people continued to commit adultery with remarkable frequency, suggesting that human sexual desires were stronger than financial calculations, or that medieval people were remarkably optimistic about their ability to avoid economic consequences. The persistence of adultery, despite enormous financial risks, reveals something important about human nature that transcends economic systems and historical periods. The legacy of medieval adultery economics shaped concepts of property rights, inheritance law, and family relationships that persisted long after the medieval period ended. Many modern legal concepts about marital property, child support, and inheritance rights can be traced back to medieval attempts to manage the economic consequences of sexual transgression. Let's be honest, the medieval Catholic Church didn't just disapprove of adultery. It declared total war on it with the kind of systematic thoroughness that would make modern military strategists weep with admiration. The Church viewed adultery as not just a personal sin or social problem, but as a direct assault on the cosmic order itself, a rebellion against God that required immediate, comprehensive, and often spectacularly brutal intervention involving everything from private confession to public excommunication to elaborate punishment rituals that turn shame into performance art. The theological foundation for the Church's position on adultery was built on a complex framework that combined biblical interpretation, Roman legal tradition, Aristotelian philosophy, and what can only be described as some seriously creative reasoning about the nature of marriage, sexuality, and divine will. According to church doctrine, marriage was a sacrament, one of only 7 sacred rituals that connected earthly life to divine grace, which meant that adultery wasn't just cheating on your spouse. It was literally desecrating a holy institution, and personally insulting God himself. To be fair, the Church's position was internally consistent, even if it was also systematically oppressive and wildly hypocritical. If marriage was a sacred reflection of Christ's relationship with the Church, then adultery was essentially a form of heresy. If sexual union within marriage was a divinely ordained blessing, then sexual union outside marriage was a diabolic corruption. If human sexuality was a gift from God that required proper stewardship, then sexual transgression was a form of theft from the divine treasury. The logic was airtight, even if the practical application was often horrifying. But here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely bonkers. The Church developed an elaborate bureaucracy of sexual regulation that made modern government oversight look efficient and reasonable. Church law didn't just prohibit adultery. It regulated every conceivable aspect of marital sexuality, from which days of the week were appropriate for sexual activity, not Sundays, Fridays, or any of the numerous holy days, to which positions were acceptable, missionary only, thank you very much, to how couples should pray before and after sexual activity. Yes, really, there were official prayers for postcoital spiritual cleansing. Canon law, the legal code of the Catholic Church, treated adultery as both a sin requiring spiritual penance and a crime requiring legal punishment, creating a 2-track system where adulterers face both ecclesiastical penalties and civil punishments. This meant that a single act of adultery could result in excommunication from the Church, public penance involving ritualized humiliation, spiritual counseling that resembled interrogation, and civil penalties that could include fines, imprisonment, physical punishment, or death. Medieval Christianity, where double jeopardy wasn't a bug. It was a feature designed by God himself. The church's approach to punishing adultery was remarkably sophisticated in its psychological understanding of shame, guilt, and social control. Public penance required adulterers to appear before their entire community, confess their sins in graphic detail, and submit to ritualized humiliation designed to reinforce both their personal guilt and the community's moral standards. These weren't private conversations with a priest. They were community theater productions with the sinner as the unwilling star performer in a morality play designed to terrify potential imitators. Medieval penitential manuals, essentially guidebooks for priests dealing with various sins, contained elaborate instructions for handling adultery cases that revealed the church's systematic approach to sexual regulation. Different types of adultery required different types of penance. A single incident with a stranger might require months of fasting and prayer, while an ongoing affair with a family member could result in years of public humiliation and social exile. The church had basically created a comprehensive taxonomy of sexual sin with corresponding punishment protocols that made modern criminal justice look simple and straightforward. The development of confession as a mandatory sacrament created unprecedented opportunities for church surveillance and control over private sexual behavior. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 required all Christians to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year, giving the church systematic access to information about adultery, sexual practices, and private relationships that no government in history had ever possessed. Confession manuals from the period show that priests were trained to ask detailed questions about sexual activity, creating a surveillance system that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. And yet, confession also created opportunities for clerical sexual abuse that the church was remarkably reluctant to address. Medieval records contain numerous accounts of priests using the confessional to extract sexual favors from female penitents, often under the threat of refusing absolution or imposing impossible penances. Some priests used confession as an opportunity to gather detailed information about women's sexual experiences for their own gratification, turning the sacrament of penance into a form of spiritual pornography. Medieval Christianity, where spiritual counseling sometimes came with a side of sexual exploitation. Meanwhile, the church's own clergy weren't exactly paragons of sexual virtue, creating a level of hypocrisy that would be hilarious if it weren't so destructive. Medieval church records are filled with cases of priests, monks, and even bishops conducting affairs, keeping concubines and fathering children they couldn't legally acknowledge. The same institution that imposed brutal punishments on lay adultery routinely covered up clerical sexual misconduct with transfers, financial payments, and selective blindness that would make modern corporate scandal management look transparent. The practice of clerical concubinage was so widespread in medieval Europe that some regions essentially gave up trying to enforce clerical celibacy and instead focused on regulating clerical relationships. Some bishops maintained official mistresses, who were recognized by church authorities and provided with financial support. Some priests left their property to their illegitimate children through elaborate legal arrangements that everyone understood but nobody officially acknowledged. Medieval Christianity, where celibacy was more of a suggestion than a requirement, at least for the clergy, but the church's treatment of lay adultery remained consistently harsh, reflecting a double standard that was both theologically unjustifiable and practically necessary for maintaining clerical authority. The reasoning was simple. If lay people were allowed the same sexual freedom that clergy routinely exercised, the moral authority of the church would collapse entirely. Better to maintain impossible standards for everyone else while quietly ignoring clerical violations than to admit that human sexuality might be more complicated than theological doctrine suggested. The concept of sanctuary provided an interesting complication in church adultery law. A woman accused of adultery could seek sanctuary in a church, where she would be protected from immediate secular punishment, while church authorities investigated her case. In theory, this provided protection for women who might be falsely accused or facing disproportionate punishment. In practice, sanctuary often just delayed the inevitable, while adding a layer of ecclesiastical approval to whatever brutal punishment was eventually imposed. The church's marriage laws created additional complications around adultery enforcement. That revealed the institution's fundamental ambivalence about human sexuality. The requirement that marriages be conducted in church and witnessed by clergy gave the church unprecedented control over who could marry whom, when they could marry, and under what circumstances marriages could be dissolved. This power was often used to punish adultery retroactively, declaring marriages invalid after adultery was discovered, legitimizing children born from affairs, or forcing adulterous couples into arranged marriages as penance. Ecclesiastical courts, the church's parallel legal system, handled most adultery cases throughout medieval Europe, operating under different rules of evidence, different concepts of justice, and different ideas about appropriate punishment than secular courts. These courts could impose punishments ranging from simple prayer and fasting to elaborate public humiliation rituals to permanent excommunication and social exile. The result was a legal maze where the same act of adultery might be treated as a minor infraction by one court and a capital offense by another, depending on which jurisdiction happened to claim authority. The international character of the Catholic Church created additional complications when adultery cases crossed political boundaries or involved people from different regions. Church law was theoretically universal, but its practical application varied dramatically depending on local customs, political pressures, and the personal attitudes of individual clerical authorities. An adultery case that resulted in death in one diocese might be resolved with simple financial compensation in another, creating a system that was both universally oppressive and locally arbitrary. The Church's relationship with secular authorities created ongoing tension around adultery, punishment that reflected broader questions about political and religious authority. Church leaders wanted to maintain their monopoly over marriage and sexual morality, while kings and nobles wanted to control their own subjects and protect their own interests. The result was a constant power struggle where adultery cases became proxy battles for larger questions about who had the right to regulate private behavior and impose public punishment. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of the Church's approach to adultery was its understanding of the relationship between private guilt and public shame. Church doctrine taught that adultery was primarily a sin against God that required internal repentance and spiritual transformation. But church practice emphasized public punishment and community humiliation that reinforced social hierarchies and institutional authority. The combination created a system of psychological control that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The Church's emphasis on virginity and sexual purity created particularly cruel contradictions for medieval women, who were simultaneously idealized as pure vessels of divine grace and demonized as sources of sexual temptation. The cult of the Virgin Mary elevated feminine purity to divine status while treating actual women's sexuality as inherently corrupting and dangerous. Women who committed adultery weren't just violating human law. They were betraying their essential nature as defined by Christian theology. Still, the Church did develop some innovative approaches to adultery prevention that went beyond simple punishment and surveillance. Marriage counseling, spiritual direction, and community support systems all emerged from Church efforts to strengthen marriages and reduce the likelihood of adultery. The problem was that these preventive measures were usually overwhelmed by the punitive systems designed to punish adultery after it occurred, creating a culture of fear rather than genuine spiritual guidance. The regional variations in church adultery enforcement were remarkable, reflecting different local traditions, political arrangements, and clerical attitudes across medieval Europe. The same adultery case might result in permanent excommunication in one region and temporary penance in another, depending on local customs and the personal preferences of individual church authorities. This created opportunities for adultery shopping, where wealthy individuals could potentially escape harsh punishment by appealing to different church jurisdictions or securing intervention from sympathetic clerical authorities. Of course, the ultimate irony of the church's war on adultery was that it probably didn't actually reduce adultery rates among either clergy or lay people. Medieval literature, court records, and popular culture all suggest that adultery remained remarkably common throughout the medieval period, despite increasingly harsh punishments and elaborate surveillance systems. Apparently, the human capacity for sexual transgression was stronger than medieval Christianity's capacity for sexual regulation, a lesson that the church was remarkably slow to learn. Let's be clear about something that medieval authorities would have preferred to keep secret. Despite all the brutal punishments, elaborate surveillance systems, and systematic oppression designed to prevent adultery, medieval people kept finding ways to conduct affairs with remarkable creativity, persistence, and success. These weren't just reckless individuals throwing caution to the wind. They were resourceful people who developed sophisticated strategies for navigating the dangerous terrain of forbidden love in a world where getting caught could literally cost them their lives. The most fundamental strategy for medieval adultery survival was the development of elaborate networks of cooperation and mutual protection that operated like underground resistance movements. Women, in particular, created informal alliances that provided lookouts, alibis, safe meeting places, and character witnesses for each other. These networks operated across social classes, with noble ladies receiving assistance from their servants, peasant women helping their neighbors, and even nuns occasionally providing sanctuary for women fleeing adultery accusations. To be fair, these networks required remarkable trust and coordination because betrayal could result in brutal punishment for everyone involved. A servant who helped her mistress conduct an affair faced the same penalties as the mistress herself if discovered, while a neighbor who provided false testimony could face charges of perjury that carried their own severe punishments. The existence of these networks, despite such risks, reveals the extent to which medieval women understood that their survival often depended on mutual support against a legal system designed to destroy them. The geography of medieval settlements created natural opportunities for clandestine meetings that resourceful adulterers learned to exploit with remarkable skill. Forests, mills, barns, abandoned buildings, and remote chapels all provided meeting places that were difficult to monitor and easy to explain if questioned. Some communities developed elaborate systems of signals and codes that allowed lovers to communicate and arrange meetings without arousing suspicion from spouses or neighbors. But here's where it gets really creative. Medieval people developed cover stories and false identities that would make modern spy agencies proud. Pilgrimages provided perfect opportunities for extended affairs because they offered legitimate reasons for travel, temporary separation from spouses, and contact with strangers. Some medieval adulterers planned elaborate pilgrimages that were actually extended romantic getaways, complete with forged documents, false identities, and carefully constructed alibis that could withstand casual investigation. The medieval guild system created additional opportunities for adultery that were both socially acceptable and practically convenient. Guild meetings, market days, religious festivals, and seasonal celebrations all provided legitimate reasons for people to gather, socialize, and interact without arousing suspicion. Some guilds developed informal traditions that essentially facilitated adultery by creating regular social opportunities, where married people could meet potential lovers and arrange subsequent encounters. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval adultery survival was the development of communication systems that allowed lovers to maintain contact despite constant surveillance. Love letters were written in code, hidden in apparently innocent locations, and transmitted through networks of trusted intermediaries. Some medieval lovers developed elaborate systems of visual signals using clothing, flowers, or household objects to communicate across distances or through crowds without anyone else understanding the messages being transmitted. The role of literacy in adultery survival created interesting class dynamics because education was largely limited to clergy and nobility, while most peasants couldn't read or write. This created opportunities for educated individuals to assist illiterate lovers with communication. But it also created vulnerabilities, because written evidence could be devastating if discovered. Some medieval lovers developed entirely non-written communication systems using objects, gestures, and symbolic arrangements that left no documentary evidence. Medieval religious institutions, ironically, provided some of the safest opportunities for adulterous relationships despite their official opposition to sexual transgression. Convents, monasteries, and churches offered spaces where men and women could meet under the pretext of religious devotion while actually conducting affairs. Some religious festivals and pilgrimages created temporary communities where normal social rules were relaxed and sexual encounters were more easily concealed. The phenomenon of spiritual marriage, supposedly platonic relationships between men and women that emphasize spiritual rather than physical connection, provided perfect cover for some medieval affairs. These relationships were officially encouraged by church authorities as examples of pure Christian love, but they also created opportunities for intimate, emotional, and physical relationships that could develop beyond official scrutiny. Some medieval spiritual marriages were probably genuine, but others were clearly elaborate cover stories for conventional affairs. Meanwhile, the economic realities of medieval life created both opportunities and necessities for adultery that authorities found difficult to prevent or punish. Merchant wives whose husbands were away for months at a time faced genuine emotional and physical needs that their absent spouses couldn't meet. Agricultural communities where men and women worked closely together during planting and harvest seasons created natural opportunities for relationships to develop beyond marriage boundaries. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created predictable opportunities for adultery that experienced lovers learned to exploit. Winter months, when outdoor work was limited, created opportunities for indoor encounters, while summer festivals and celebrations provided cover for temporary relationships. Some medieval communities developed informal traditions around seasonal celebrations that essentially sanctioned temporary sexual freedom, though these traditions were rarely officially acknowledged or documented. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of medieval adultery survival was the development of emotional and mental strategies for managing the stress, guilt, and fear that accompanied forbidden relationships. Medieval lovers had to navigate not just practical challenges, but intense psychological pressure from religious doctrine that defined their relationships as sinful, social expectations that demanded absolute fidelity, and personal guilt that could be overwhelming. Some medieval people resolved these psychological conflicts by developing alternative religious or philosophical frameworks that justified their behavior despite official condemnation. Courtly love literature provided models for relationships that transcended conventional marriage. While some individuals developed personal theological positions that emphasized divine forgiveness over human judgment. Others simply compartmentalized their emotional lives, maintaining separate identities as faithful spouses and passionate lovers, without attempting to reconcile the two contradictions. The class-based variations in adultery survival strategies were remarkable, reflecting different resources, opportunities, and constraints faced by people in different social positions. Noble adultery often involved elaborate political calculations, international travel, and complex financial arrangements that were impossible for peasants to access. Peasant adultery required different skills focused on local knowledge, community, relationships, and agricultural rhythms that nobles might not understand. Merchant families developed their own unique approaches to adultery survival that reflected their position between noble and peasant communities. Merchant wealth provided opportunities for travel, communication, and financial arrangements that peasants couldn't access, while merchant social mobility created networking opportunities that traditional nobles might not have. Some merchant families developed elaborate business arrangements that essentially facilitated adultery by creating legitimate reasons for travel, extended absences, and contact with diverse social groups. The international character of medieval trade and politics created opportunities for adultery that transcended local surveillance and punishment systems. A merchant conducting business in distant cities could maintain relationships that would be impossible to discover or punish in his home community. A noble woman traveling with diplomatic missions could conduct affairs that would never be reported to her husband or local authorities. Some medieval people essentially lived double lives in different regions, maintaining separate relationships and identities that never intersected. Still, the most remarkable aspect of medieval adultery survival was its persistence despite increasingly brutal punishments and elaborate prevention systems. Medieval court records, literature, and popular culture all suggest that adultery remained common throughout the medieval period, indicating that human sexual desires were stronger than legal threats, or the medieval people were remarkably optimistic about their ability to avoid detection. Probably both. The technological limitations of medieval surveillance created inherent advantages for people conducting affairs despite the harsh legal consequences. Communication was slow, travel was difficult, and verification of information was nearly impossible across distances. A person accused of adultery in one location might have weeks or months to prepare alibis, secure witnesses, or simply flee to another jurisdiction before authorities could coordinate investigation or punishment. Of course, the survival strategies that worked for some medieval adulterers were disastrous for others, creating a selection bias in the historical record where we primarily know about successful adultery through literature and unsuccessful adultery through court records. The medieval people who were caught, punished, and destroyed by adultery accusations left extensive documentary evidence, while those who successfully conducted affairs and avoided detection left little trace for modern historians to discover. The legacy of medieval adultery survival strategies shaped concepts of privacy, personal autonomy, and resistance to authority that persisted long after the medieval period ended. The networks of cooperation, communication systems, and survival strategies developed by medieval adulterers provided models for later resistance movements, facing different forms of oppression and social control. And there you have it, a journey through one of the most brutal, creative, and fundamentally human aspects of medieval life, where love, lust, and legal barbarism collided in ways that make modern relationship drama look like a gentle disagreement over Netflix passwords. We've explored a world where adultery wasn't just personal betrayal but political earthquake, where punishments ranged from public humiliation to creative torture, and where the gap between official morality and actual human behavior was wide enough to drive a medieval ox cart through What strikes me most about this entire dark comedy of medieval justice is how remarkably familiar it all feels. Despite the centuries that separate us from these long-dead adulterers and their creative tormentors, strip away the elaborate punishment devices, the religious justifications, and the political complications, and you're left with the same fundamental human struggles that define relationships today. The tension between desire and commitment, the challenge of maintaining intimacy over time, the temptation of forbidden attraction, and the devastating consequences when private choices become public scandals. Let's be honest, medieval people weren't fundamentally different from us. They fell in love with the wrong people, made terrible decisions in moments of passion, convinced themselves they could get away with it, and then faced consequences that were often wildly disproportionate to their actual crimes. The only real difference is that when they got caught, they didn't just face angry spouses and awkward social situations. They faced public humiliation, physical torture, social exile, or death. To be fair, the medieval approach to adultery punishment reveals something important about how societies attempt to control behavior that threatens their fundamental assumptions about order, property, and power. Medieval adultery law wasn't really about protecting marriages or preventing sexual transgression. It was about maintaining a social system that depended on clear bloodlines, stable property rights, and absolute male authority over female sexuality. The brutal punishments served as public theater designed to reinforce these power structures while simultaneously revealing their fundamental fragility. The regional variations we explored show how differently human societies can respond to identical behaviors depending on their legal traditions, economic systems, and cultural values. A woman who committed adultery might face death in one kingdom and mere fines in another, revealing the extent to which justice was really just local prejudice backed up by legal authority and sharp instruments. Medieval Europe, where your survival often depended more on geography than guilt. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this entire story is how consistently medieval people managed to subvert, survive, and resist the systems designed to control them. Despite brutal punishments, elaborate surveillance, and systematic oppression, people kept finding ways to conduct affairs, maintain forbidden relationships, and assert sexual autonomy in a world designed to deny them any form of personal choice. The persistence of adultery throughout the medieval period, despite increasingly harsh consequences, reveals something essential about human nature that transcends historical periods and legal systems. The gender dynamics we explored reveal a double standard so systematic and brutal that it would be darkly comic if it weren't so destructive. Medieval society created a system where women were simultaneously held responsible for their own sexual behavior and denied any agency over their sexual choices, where they faced death for adultery while their male counterparts faced minor social inconvenience, and where their value as human beings was determined entirely by their sexual purity. And yet, medieval women developed remarkable strategies for survival, resistance, and mutual support that challenge modern assumptions about historical female powerlessness. The economic dimensions of medieval adultery reveal how sexual behavior becomes entangled with property rights, inheritance law, and political power in ways that turn private relationships into public policy. When a woman's adultery could redistribute massive wealth or destabilize entire kingdoms, the personal became political in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Medieval adultery law was essentially property law with more torture and fewer lawyers. The religious aspects show how theological doctrine can be twisted to justify almost any form of cruelty while simultaneously being ignored when convenient for those in power. The medieval church declared war on adultery while routinely overlooking the sexual misconduct of its own clergy, creating a system of moral regulation that was both totalitarian in scope and selectively enforced based on social status and political connections. Meanwhile, the creative punishments we examined reveal both the impressive human capacity for systematic cruelty and the remarkable ineffectiveness of brutal deterrence. Medieval communities invested enormous creativity and resources in developing increasingly elaborate ways to torture adulterers. Yet adultery rates remained fairly constant throughout the period. Apparently, the human drive for sexual expression was stronger than the fear of creative torture, or medieval people were remarkably bad at risk assessment. Probably both. The survival strategies revealed the flip side of this story: the impressive human capacity for adaptation, resistance, and creative problem-solving under impossible circumstances. Medieval people developed communication networks, cover stories, and survival techniques that would impress modern intelligence agencies, all in service of maintaining forbidden relationships in a world where discovery meant death. What does all this tell us about human nature, social control, and the relationship between law and behavior? First, that people will continue to pursue emotional and sexual fulfillment regardless of legal consequences, social pressure, or religious doctrine. Second, that societies which attempt to control private behavior through public punishment often create more problems than they solve. Third, that power structures justified by moral authority are often the most corrupt and hypocritical. The legacy of medieval adultery law shaped concepts of marriage, sexuality, and gender relations that persisted for centuries and continue to influence modern attitudes. Many contemporary assumptions about female sexuality, male honor, and the relationship between personal behavior and social order can be traced back to medieval attempts to regulate sexual transgression through legal violence. But perhaps the most important lesson from this dark chapter of human history is that love, desire, and human connection are stronger than law, tradition, or fear. Despite facing punishments that would make modern people weep with terror, medieval people continued to fall in love, conduct affairs, and assert sexual autonomy. They found ways to communicate across surveillance systems, to meet despite constant monitoring, and to maintain relationships despite impossible odds. So the next time you're dealing with modern relationship drama, infidelity apps, divorce, lawyers, custody battles, or awkward family dinners, remember that you're part of a tradition that stretches back through centuries of human struggle with the same fundamental challenges. The stakes may be lower now, but the essential human desires and conflicts remain remarkably consistent across time and culture. At least today, when someone cheats on their spouse, the worst that typically happens is a messy divorce and some uncomfortable social situations. In medieval times, adultery could literally cost you your life, your family's fortune, and your immortal soul. Modern relationship problems, where the consequences are emotional rather than existential, financial rather than fatal. Progress of a sort. Interesting, and by interesting, I mean absolutely bonkers. The punishment for adultery in medieval times wasn't just about the act itself. Oh no, that would be too simple. It was about who you were, who you cheated with, what social class you belonged to, which country you happened to be fornicating in, and sometimes even what day of the week you got caught. Sound familiar? Well, maybe not the medieval part, but the whole different rules for different people thing certainly rings a bell. To be fair, adultery in medieval times carried stakes that modern cheating simply doesn't. We're talking about inheritance rights, political alliances, questions of legitimacy that could topple kingdoms, and bloodlines that determined who got to wear the fancy hat and make everyone else's lives miserable. When a queen stepped out on her king, it wasn't just about hurt feelings. It was treason. When a peasant woman cheated on her husband, it might mean questions about who actually owned that patch of turnips. And yet, for all the brutal punishments we're about to explore, medieval people were still, fundamentally, people. They fell in love with the wrong person, They made terrible decisions in moments of passion. They got bored with their spouses, and they convinced themselves they could get away with it. The only difference is that when they got caught, they didn't just face an angry spouse and an awkward conversation with friends. They faced public humiliation, physical torture, exile, or death. Sometimes all four, if they were particularly unlucky. What makes this topic so fascinating isn't just the spectacle of the punishments themselves, though trust me, we'll get to some truly wild examples, but what these punishments reveal about medieval society's deepest anxieties and values. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully designed systems meant to reinforce social order, protect property rights, and send a message so clear that even the most romantically inclined troublemaker would think twice before climbing through the wrong bedroom window. Of course, the definition of adultery itself was wonderfully inconsistent. A married woman having an affair? Definitely adultery. A married man visiting a prostitute? Well, that's just Tuesday. A noble having a fling with a servant? Barely worth mentioning. But that same servant seducing the noble? Time to sharpen the executioner's axe. The medieval world was nothing if not consistent in its inconsistency. Meanwhile, the methods of punishment ranged from the almost reasonable fines, public penance, annulment, to the absolutely barbaric. We'll explore communities that literally branded adulterers, courts that ordered public whippings, and societies that developed punishment devices so specific to adultery that they basically had cottage industries built around marital revenge dot throughout all of this. Though, remember that we're looking at a world where the average person couldn't read, where medical knowledge consisted largely of you tried bleeding more, and where the idea of individual rights was about as foreign as the concept of Wi-Fi. These punishments, brutal as they were, made perfect sense to people living in a world where survival often depended on rigid social hierarchies and where stepping out of line, literally or figuratively, could destabilize everything from family fortunes to international politics. So settle in, because we're about to take a journey through some of the most creative, brutal, and occasionally hilariously over the top punishments ever devised for the simple act of loving someone you weren't supposed to love. And by the end of this, I guarantee you'll have a whole new appreciation for modern relationship problems. After all, the worst thing that can happen to you today is probably a nasty divorce and some awkward family dinners. In medieval times, well, let's just say you might lose more than half your assets.